All right, ladies and gentlemen, welcome to the first of our anatomy lecture videos that's going to be about histology. This covers all four tissue types, so it may get a little long, but feel free to pause, rewind, and do what you need to with this video in order to learn the topic. So let's get moving. So the first thing we talked about with histology is we wanted to differentiate between cytology and histology. You can often study both of them at the same time, but there's a difference between them. Cytology is examining a single cell type, and a lot of times it's used to screen for certain diseases, especially cancer, fetal abnormalities, a pap smear, which is a test designed to test for cervical cancer, and also to diagnose infectious organisms. There are a number of ways to collect the test. You can actually scrape off tissue. You can collect bodily fluids. You can actually withdraw some of it from the body using like a fine needle, and there are other types of biopsy as well. This, for example, is an image of a piece of salivary gland that has cancerous cells in it. So you can see individual cells. They are the dark blue shapes, which I believe are the nuclei. It's a little hard to see the actual distinctions between the cells on this image. Histology, on the other hand, is looking at tissues as a whole rather than just the individual cell types that make them up. You're usually studying this through a microscope. A lot of times what will happen is you'll take whatever tissue that you're trying to study, slice it up into very thin sections, put those on glass slides, and then look at them under a microscope. When you're studying this as a course, say in college or in medical school, you're looking at how structure, relates to function. But if you are doing this because it is your profession, you are a pathologist, you're usually looking at tissue samples to diagnose disease, which means that you need to be able to identify normal, healthy looking tissue, so that way you can also be able to identify abnormal, unhealthy tissue as well. So here are some histology samples. This is an exocrine duct. It is a duct that produces material that will be released through a duct, a tube, and it can be released into like the outside environment. So some examples of exocrine ducts are like sweat glands and such things. You can see that we have individual cells that are much easier to distinguish than in the other image. This is one cell. That dark spot is its nucleus. Traditionally, when we're looking at these images, the dark spots tend to be nuclei. So this looks like it's a nucleus, this looks like it's a nucleus, and this looks like a nucleus. So you can start to use that to try and identify individual cells. Then here is another slide. This one is a section of bone tissue. And what you see, this is actually where blood vessels will run through. And then each of these dark little spots right here is actually a kind of hole in the bone tissue where bone cells will reside. And they build the bone structure around them, and then they stay in their like kind of bone cocoon and help maintain the bone tissue that surrounds them. So what is the difference between the two of them? Well, cytology, you may be looking at a block of tissue, but you're usually trying to examine just a single cell type. Histology, you're looking at the entire chunk of tissue, or at least looking at multiple cell types. So now that we've mentioned tissues, let's talk about the tissues that are found in the body. There are 4 different tissues which in various combinations make up each of your organs and make up your entire body. Connective tissue is the second one we're going to cover. It's a bit complicated. Epithelial tissue is usually going to line a surface and serve as a barrier. Muscle tissue is distinguished by the fact that it can cause movement and it contracts, and nervous tissue sends signals. So our first tissue is epithelial tissue. Epithelial tissue is made of large sheets of tissue that are going to cover either an organ or perhaps the whole surface of the body as the skin does. It is avascular, meaning there are no blood vessels running through epithelial tissue, which is very logical because, epithelial tissue is a gatekeeper, it is a boundary, it is forming a border between an organ and the rest of your body, or between your body and the outside environment. And you don't want it to be like perforated or kind of bunch of holes poked through it for blood vessels. So let's say that this diagram here represented a small chunk of epithelial tissue. You would not find any blood vessels going in between the cells because there are no gaps between the cells. Since this is going to act as a boundary, you want to make sure that it doesn't have any holes in it. Just like it doesn't make sense to make, a house and put a bunch of holes in it with no way to close them. You would have blood vessels probably running very close underneath. So this is a blood vessel with some blood flowing through it. And what will happen is materials will pass from this blood vessel, and they'll pass through the membranes of individual cells through layers of tissue, and they'll pass on to the epithelial tissue. So things like oxygen will pass this way, glucose, which is the fuel, the sugar for a lot of your body, will pass this way, and then things like carbon dioxide and waste will then pass out of the epithelial tissue to the blood vessels. So if you've got a really thick layer of epithelial tissue, only the basal surface of it will have easy access to nutrients because it's going to be the part that is closest to whatever blood supply you have. Now, the basal surface is the bottom, the base of this tissue, and it's defined as being the stuff that is attached to the basement membrane. The basement membrane has two layers: the basal lamina, which is some kind of extracellular stuff that goes outside of cells, that's produced by the epithelial tissue. And then usually there's a layer of connective tissue just inside of it, and it secretes or releases materials that become the reticular lamina. And both together make up the basement membrane that separates epithelial tissue from what's usually connective tissue underneath it. The surface of the epithelial tissue that's farthest away from the basement membrane is called the apical surface, and it's called that because it is the apex or top of the cell layers. And another thing that I wanted to talk about, these are protective layers, which means that they're more likely to get damaged. So they will have very rapid reproduction to allow fast healing, because if you've got this boundary, this kind of set of structures that are protecting your insides, you don't want to have holes in that protection for very long because you don't want bacteria to get through. Let's say that this was another cell and there was a gap between these cells. Any sort of bacterium that was nearby would be able to then come in through that hole and would be able to infect the body. So you don't want that kind of gap in your protective layer. So where do we find it? A number of places. For example, this bottom image, this is skin. This down here is connective tissue. And the purple layer, that's epithelial tissue. Multiple layers of epithelial tissue. Then you will find it in the linings of some organs that will help create boundaries. So this up here, for example, these are individual, this is a single layer of cells that is separating the small intestine from the contents of the small intestine, which is logical. You've got some stuff in your small intestine that you don't want leaking into your surrounding tissue, like stuff that's being digested and enzymes. And then you'll also find it serves as gland tissue where it will produce chemicals. This is actually a salivary gland, and you can see this kind of multi-layer bit of epithelial tissue, and its job is to produce saliva. The reproductive structures will also have epithelial tissue lining them, as will this is a very special type of epithelial tissue called transitional epithelial tissue, and its job is to basically surround the bladder, the urinary bladder, and it can expand and contract with the expansion and contraction of the urinary bladder. And then there are also spots in the alveoli and lungs. These are basically the air sacs that make up the lung tissue, where you have oxygen and carbon dioxide being exchanged. And they're made up of a single layer of thin epithelial tissue. It has to be thin because you want oxygen and carbon dioxide to be able to cross easily. Now, as for general functions, beyond the protection and the aspect of controlling what can enter and exit whatever part of the body the epithelial tissue is presenting, there are two other main functions, one of which is to act as a gland. These epithelial tissues will produce some chemical or some substance, and they will secrete it or release it outside of that organ, that tissue. A lot of times, for example, well, there are sweat glands and there are also oil glands that will release to the outside of your cell. These gastric glands will release digestive juices into the stomach. These pancreas glands will release enzymes that get transferred to the small intestine, and the salivary glands will just empty directly out into your mouth. We'll talk about endocrine glands later when we talk about that actual system. These smaller glands that release through a duct are called exocrine glands. And there's a third type of gland, a mucus gland, which is actually just a single cell called a goblet cell. So these goblet cells, their job is they stick in a layer of epithelial tissue and they make mucus. They release that mucus, and that mucus can then coat whatever organ or opening that is basically covering that layer of cells. And mucus has a lot of functions. Mucus is a very important protective barrier. It's sticky, it's gooey. So, for example, the mucus that is found in your respiratory system, its job is to catch any viruses, bacteria, any solid substances that get in through your lungs. And then, what are called the ciliated layers, they have these individual cilia, which are hair-like structures that stick off the top or apical surface of these cells. And those cilia move back and forth, and they can sweep material along. So they can move the mucus in a certain direction, and in your respiratory system, that mucus gets moved to your esophagus, which is the opening into your digestive tract, and then you swallow it, and anything that was trapped in that mucus gets digested and destroyed before it can harm you. Goblet cells are found very frequently in these ciliated layers because it doesn't make a lot of sense to make a bunch of mucus and have it coat you without having a way to move that mucus and anything dangerous trapped in it out of the way. So we have to classify epithelial tissues by a couple of characteristics, the first of which is the shape. So a squamous cell, I like to think of it as a squashed cell. That's probably the root word where the name comes from. They are flattened and thin. They are sometimes called scale-like because they are flat and thin like a scale, and also like scales, like the type you find on lizards and other reptiles. These cells are usually very protective. So when you have a couple of layers of squamous cells, those are usually designed to protect something. Cuboidal cells, on the other hand, are cube-shaped, just like their name suggests. And they also tend to have their nucleus located towards the center. Columnar cells are the ones that are often the ciliated ones. They are taller than they are wide, they are rectangular, and their nuclei tend to sit towards the bottom. And by the way, this colored layer right here, that is our basement membrane. So here, that is the basement membrane, and here, that is the basement membrane as well. So you can see basal surface, apical surface. Get used to those terms. Cilia are never found on the basal surface because the basal surface is almost glued down to the basement membrane. Then, you can also name epithelial tissue for the number of layers that you find. If you find a single layer, it is going to be a simple epithelium. And then you usually combine that with the shape name to get a longer, more complicated name. For example, at the top, that's simple squamous epithelium. And it's usually the number of layers in the name followed by the shape of the actual cells. Now, when you have something that's stratified, that means there are multiple layers, and you generally name for whatever the shape of the top layer is, that shape of the cell. So in this guy, these are kind of cuboidal because they're about as wide as they are tall, and so these will be cuboidal. But since there is more than one layer, it will be stratified cuboidal. So what's most common in your body is stratified squamous, a lot of layers of squamous cells. What is rarer is cuboidal, stratified cuboidal, and even more rare is stratified columnar. You don't tend to see that very often. What you do tend to see is pseudostratified. Pseudo means fake, means this type of tissue is lying to you. It's not a single layer. It's not multiple layers. It's not stratified. It is actually a simple tissue, but it looks stratified. If you'll look, every single cell is attached to the basement membrane, even if only a little tiny bit, and that makes them by definition a single layer of cells. A lot of times these pseudostratified epithelial layers will have goblet cells, so they'll produce mucus, and then they'll have cilia at the top, so that way they can sweep that mucus along. And then there's a last type that I lump in here because it's got multiple layers, but honestly it's named for both the number of layers and the fact that these layers don't have very consistent shapes, and that's transitional epithelium. The individual cells will change shape as it's stretched or as it contracts, and this is the type of epithelial tissue that's found in the urinary bladder. So it can expand when the bladder expands, it can contract when the bladder contracts as well. So now let's move on to the giant, big, confusing connective tissue. Connective tissue isn't as easy to kind of describe as all of the other tissues because the things that all connective tissues have in common are a little less obvious. But what they do have in common is they are all going to contain these three components: cells, a matrix, and then in that matrix, you'll have some scattered protein fibers that are going to help contribute to the structure and the function of that tissue. What are the functions of connective tissue? Well, like the name suggests, it connects. It also can provide support for different organs. It can be a protective layer. It can transport because both the blood and the lymph are part of our types of connective tissue. It can store materials, not just storing materials like fat tissue, but bone also stores calcium and some minerals for you. And since the cells of the immune system tend to travel mostly through the blood, we can also say it defends the body against foreign invaders. So, depending on the specific type of connective tissue you're looking at, you'll find a number of different cells. The one that's most common in most types of connective tissue, or more types of connective tissue, are fibroblasts, also known as fibrocytes. And just remember, what does cytes mean? It means cells. So all the rest of these words, adipocytes, chondrocytes, osteocytes, erythrocytes, leukocytes, those are all types of cells. Fibroblasts are the most common type of cell that's located in connective tissue. Their job is to produce and maintain the matrix that's around them. Adipocytes, like this guy right here, they look tubby because unfortunately they're responsible for making us tubby when we are so. They store fat. So they store any extra energy that you've taken in that you haven't burned off. It gets stored in the form of fat, and that fat gets stored in adipocytes as a big fat oil droplet. Sorry, adipocytes are not my favorite. Mesenchymal cells are actually stem cells. They are going to be found scattered throughout connective tissue, and if some of the cells are damaged or if some parts of the tissue are damaged, then these mesenchymal cells can differentiate or become many of these cell types and replace those missing cells. Now, in specific types of connective tissue, you will sometimes find specific types of cells. So, for example, chondrocytes, which is what this little pink structure is, that's a chondrocyte, are the cells in cartilage, and they're the ones who produce and maintain the matrix that makes up cartilage. They're only found in cartilage. Osteocytes, on the other hand, like this guy up here, those are only found in bone. They are the cells that produce bone, produce the mineral bone, and then they maintain it once they're surrounded in it. Erythrocyte is a fancy name for a pretty familiar type of cell, a red blood cell. Their job is to carry oxygen around. So here is an erythrocyte. Leukocytes is the general term for white blood cells. There are multiple types of leukocytes, which we'll talk more about when we talk about the immune system. They tend to circulate through both the blood as well as the lymph. So, the second component of connective tissue is extracellular matrix. It's a mix of protein fibers, which we'll discuss in a moment, and ground substance that surrounds all of the cells in connective tissue. Ground substance is a fluid or a mineral, something filling the spaces between the protein fibers and cells. Now, in a lot of connective tissues, the cells and the protein fibers can be scattered. They can be widely spread apart, unlike epithelial tissue where everything is very tightly packed together. Um, and in other connective tissues, you might have everything very tightly packed together and very little ground substance. It just depends on the tissue you're looking at. So ground substance can be fluid, like it is in a lot of connective tissue proper, which we'll talk about in a moment, or like in blood, or it can be a mineral, like the calcium-rich bone, and therefore it can be solid. Now, protein fibers, there are 3 different types, and each type gives different properties to the type of tissue that it's in. So the easiest one to get the concept of are the elastic fibers. They act almost like little tiny rubber bands. Here is an elastic fiber right here. It's fairly thin, it's stretchy, and once you finish stretching it, once you release the tension on it, it's going to return back to its original shape. So any type of tissue that has a lot of elastic fiber in it is going to be stretchy. On the other hand, reticular fibers are usually found in a network. So you see how you have all of these interconnections, and those interconnections mean that you're not going to be able to stretch that very much. Reticular fiber is not stretchy like elastic fiber. This is a type of fiber that's going to provide structural support. So you'll find it in tissues that require a lot of structural support, and here that is actually reticular fiber, and you can see how it kind of is connected in a net. And last but most certainly not least is collagen. It can bend, but it cannot stretch. So this, for example, that's a collagen fiber right here. Notice it's thicker than the other ones because collagen in actuality is thicker than the other 2 types of fiber. It is very strong, it resists stretching, and it's tough. So in some of the tough tissues that are going to have a lot of force put on them, you're going to have a lot of cartilage because it helps your body resist that pulling force. So we can divide up connective tissue into 3 major categories, and we're going to start from the right side of this table because those are kind of some of the more familiar connective tissues. There are fluid connective tissues, which are blood and lymph. They have a watery, very spread out matrix. So a few cells plunked down in a watery matrix with few, if any, protein fibers. Supportive connective tissue does what its name says. It supports things. So cartilage will form a supportive structure in parts of your body. There are multiple types of cartilage, but we'll talk about that in more detail when we actually talk about the skeletal system later in the year. And then you have bones, which there are also multiple types of bone tissue, but like I said, we'll talk about that with skeletal tissue. Then there is connective tissue proper, which is probably going to be the hardest one to learn just because it's not a type of tissue you're used to thinking about. So it can be divided into 2 groups, loose connective tissue, and just like the name suggests, things are loosely spread out. There are 3 different types. We'll talk about each of those types. And then dense connective tissue, everything is very densely packed together. So that's where it gets its name from. And there are 3 types of that as well. So let's first talk about connective tissue proper. It's a type of tissue that has a lot of fibroblasts in it. It can have several other cell types in it, including some immune cells, so cells of the immune system whose job is to just kind of wander around in the connective tissue and make sure that there is no sort of a foreign invader inside. You'll also have things like this mesenchymal cell, which is a stem cell. So if this fibroblast right here were to die, this mesenchymal cell could reproduce another one. It could make more. And then you have all of the various fibers. So here's collagen, here's elastic fiber, here's reticular fibers. Notice the reticular fibers look kind of like a spider web because they look like a net. And notice the collagen fibers are very thick. And they're strong and they are thick. So now let's examine each of the two types of connective tissue. Loose connective tissue usually does not have very tightly packed fibers, things are spread out. This is the kind of tissue that not only absorbs some shock and helps hold tissues together or bind them, it also, since there's, a loose gathering of fibers, it also allows materials like water, salts, nutrients, food, molecules like glucose to very easily pass through. There are three different subtypes. So adipose tissue is what you see up here at the top. It's filled with a lot of adipocytes, and each of those adipocytes is storing a droplet of fat. It's also got plenty of blood vessels, so that way when you need to break down that fat, you can get the energy into your blood vessels fairly easy. And this empty looking space in the adipocyte, that's not actually empty, that's oil. You can see each of them is basically a bag of oil. Areolar tissue is a little less specific in function. It's a space filler that can also provide some support. So notice you have some elastic fibers, you have some collagen fibers, and then you have numerous cell types, including some immune cells like the mast cell and the macrophage. You can have some scattered adipocytes and fibrocytes as well. And reticular tissue, notice that it's got a ton of reticular fibers, which is where it gets its name from. It's a lot of mesh-like reticular fibers kind of scattered around and connected to each other. So this is great tissue for supporting parts of the body or organs. Dense connective tissue, on the other hand, has fibers that are very closely packed together. And because they tend to be primarily collagen fibers, this type of tissue is going to resist stretching. Most dense connective tissue isn't really going to be very elastic. There are three different types. Regular connective tissue has all of the fibers basically lined up in parallel. You can see that in this image to the side. All the fibers are running basically across the image like this. And they're all parallel to each other. What that means is that if you tried to stretch it in the direction that the fibers point to, you wouldn't really be able to stretch it because it's going to be able to resist that because it's made of collagen, which, while it's flexible, is not stretchy. Because of this, you can put a lot of force on these tissues and they will not break. I mean, you can put enough force on them to break them because regular dense connective tissue forms ligaments and tendons. And I know more than one of you has had a torn ACL or MCL or torn a rotator cuff, all of which are made of either ligaments or tendons. But they can resist a lot of force before they get to the point where they are torn. Irregular dense connective tissue is also chock full, packed full of fibers, especially collagen fibers, but you'll notice that they are not parallel. And you might even see, if you looked at the next layer of tissues above, all of those fibers might be running like across it. This type of tissue is going to resist stretching in any direction. It can also take an impact really easily, so in a place where you need some protection. It's found in tissue that surrounds your muscles. It's found in joint capsules, which are the areas around the joints between your bones, and it is also found in the layer of your skin just under the epithelial tissue, the dermis. And then elastic tissue is basically dense connective tissue with some elastic fibers thrown in. It does allow some stretching. And the couple of places where it's located in your lungs and your arteries, which is really important because when you breathe in, you want your lungs to be able to expand to hold the extra air that you're taking in. And then when you breathe out, you want to be able to have your lungs come back to their smaller size, so that way the next time you expand them, they can suck in some air. So the elastic fibers there are allowing for that property. Supporting connective tissue, like I said, supports things, helps keep things upright. An important note, it is more matrix than it is cell. And so the cells tend to, and since this matrix is a little more solid than the other matrix in other connective tissue, we have these little holes or empty spaces that are in the matrix called lacunae, or a single one is a lacuna. And these lacunae are the spots where the cells in these tissues sit. So for example, everywhere you see cells here, each of those cells is sitting in its own lacuna. It's very hard to see on the bone one. It was hard to find a good bone picture that would show you the lacunae and the osteocytes and the general structure. But anyway, depending on which type of tissue you are, whether you're cartilage or bone, you will have different cells. Cartilage has chondrocytes. Literally, chondro means cartilage. Bone, on the other hand, contains osteocytes, and osteo means bone. They have some other differences beside the cells types. For example, cartilage is avascular. That A in front means not, meaning it's not vascular, which means no blood vessels, just like the epithelial tissue. Because of this lack of blood vessels, the cells can't get nutrients as easily as other cells, and they don't reproduce as quickly, which means when you damage your cartilage, it stays damaged longer. But it is not only a solid matrix, but it's rubbery, which means it's flexible. So hopefully that will result in less injuries to it. Hopefully. They still happen. Bone is heavily vascularized, which means that it's getting an adequate blood supply. So that way it is capable of healing fairly easily, especially compared to cartilage. This tissue is rigid and unbending. It is made of a solid crystallized matrix made up of these calcium crystals, and it does have some collagen fibers stuck in it, which give the bone a little more flexibility than it would have if it was just straight calcium. So there's a little give in your bones. They can bend a little, but once you bend past a certain level, they'll break. The fluid connective tissues have watery lymph and cells just kind of floating through them. There are few, if any, protein fibers floating around, and their job tends to be transport. So blood has erythrocytes, which are red blood cells, leukocytes, which are white blood cells like this guy, and platelets like this little bit and this little bit, which are little chunks of cells whose job is to clot up when you have a break in your blood vessel. So they plug the hole, basically. And this stuff circulates through blood vessels in your body, which I'm sure you're familiar with. Lymph is probably less familiar. It is basically all the fluid that is surrounding your cells because your blood vessels can be very leaky and let fluid into the surrounding area. They're designed to work that way. Well, that fluid needs to be collected somewhere. Otherwise, you're just going to get puffier and puffier. So your lymph collects that fluid, it drains into lymphatic vessels, and then it drains back into the blood vessels. So that way you don't lose a bunch of water that's just swelling up your body. In the process, a bunch of leukocytes will get into the lymphatic system, and it will contain a lot of white blood cells, which is why your doctor feels your neck when they're trying to determine if you're sick, because there's some easy to feel lymph nodes there, and if they're swollen, that means there are a lot of white blood cells gathering there, so there's probably an infection you're fighting off. All right, let's talk about muscular tissue. Muscular tissue has two major properties. It is excitable, meaning that you can send it a signal or a stimulus and it will respond to that. The signal often comes from the nervous system and it's usually a direction to contract. So that's the second major property of muscular tissue. It is contractile. It can shorten, and when it shortens, it can pull on something. All of your skeletal muscles tend to be attached to points on your skeleton, and usually they're attached to more than one bone. So when they shorten, they're going to pull one bone towards another. This type of movement can be voluntary, which means you consciously control it, like in your arms, your legs, anything that you decide to move, or it can be involuntary, which means it's not consciously controlled. So a lot of the muscle that's in your internal organs is involuntary. You don't have to consciously think about it to make it move, and even if you wanted to, you couldn't stop it from moving. The main cell type that's found in muscular tissue is called a myocyte. Myo means muscle. Cyte means, as we talked about earlier, cell. Literally, it's a muscle cell. So there are three major types of muscle tissue. Skeletal muscle, which you see here on the left, it is characterized by being able to see individual cells, which are these very long tubes. And you can also see these stripes called striations. And that's how you can identify, oh yeah, I'm looking at some skeletal muscle. Smooth muscle is not going to show those same striping patterns. So for example, like this would be a smooth muscle cell. So notice they're not super long tubes. They have a definite beginning and an end. Um, so they are going to look very different from skeletal muscle. And finally, cardiac muscle, its distinct property is that it is branched. You can see that the fibers are actually interconnected, the cells are interconnected, and we'll talk about why that's important in a moment. So first, let's talk about skeletal muscle. It is voluntary. You can directly control it from your conscious mind, and it makes possible all the movements that you think of and then initiate. So locomotion, moving from one place to another, your facial expressions, your posture, moving to pick up a cup, getting up, sitting down, all of those are mediated by your skeletal muscle. Your skeletal muscle has this very distinct striped appearance, so much so that the term for those stripes or striations is also another name for skeletal muscle. It's sometimes called striated muscle. And those two terms are interchangeable. Skeletal muscle has more jobs than just helping you move. When you're using those muscles, they use up a lot of energy and they actually release a lot of heat. So you can use the heat that's generated by these skeletal muscles to help you keep your body temperature up. So if you're sitting in a room and you're really, really cold, one of the things you can do to get up, to help you warm yourself up a little bit is to get up and walk around. Your muscles will generate some heat, which should help warm you up. Smooth muscle, on the other hand, you really cannot see distinctive cells in here. If I was trying to outline a cell, I think this is a cell. It's a little hard to see. It does not have any striations, and it is involuntary. You do not tell your smooth muscle when to contract or not contract. Another thing, while your skeletal muscle can have very quick contractions to help you move very quickly, smooth muscle has slow and smooth kind of contractions. So basically, there'll be these long, very gentle contractions that will gradually push stuff along. You don't really hurry smooth muscle along. And this type of muscle can be found anywhere from your esophagus, which is the basically pipe in your throat that food goes down, to your stomach, to your intestines, all the way to your rectum and your anus. Those are, well, not your anus, your rectum, which are all surrounded by smooth muscle. Then your urinary system is also going to be surrounded by smooth muscle, as well as parts of the reproductive system. So, for example, I told one class that the uterus has a very thick ball of muscle that's made of smooth muscle. Then your airways also contain smooth muscle. So if you have asthma, every time you have an asthma attack, your bronchi, or the tubes that are going from your windpipe to your lungs, are getting smaller, and that constriction could be due to smooth muscle. And your arteries also have some smooth muscle in them as well, which lets them constrict or get smaller, narrower, or let them dilate, which means they get wider. And these myocytes are spindle shaped, which is what I mean right here. So a spindle shape, it's fat in the middle and it kind of tapers off or gets thinner at the ends. You can see here what both a relaxed smooth muscle cell and a contracted smooth muscle cell look like. It's very different from what skeletal muscle does when it contracts. And like I said, we'll talk about that more when we talk about the skeletal system later. Cardiac muscle is a very specialized type of muscle tissue that's only found in your heart. It is involuntary. You cannot tell your heart to stop beating, it will continue on. But it doesn't necessarily need any influence from the nervous system in order to contract. Your heart tissue can beat without your nervous system telling it to. It will contract on its own. In fact, some people have actually cultured or grown outside of a body some heart muscle cells, and they will contract regularly on their own. You actually have a group of cells that's located in your heart called pacemaker cells, and they will be the ones that kind of coordinate and direct your heart to beat. And your heart needs to beat in a very synchronized manner. If it doesn't, you could get some cells contracting, some cells not. And you don't want that to happen because the beating of your heart is what's moving blood around in your body. If you don't move blood around in your body's not getting nutrients or oxygen. So these cells are actually physically interconnected with these cell junctions. They're called intercalated discs. We'll talk about them more when we talk about the respiratory system. And they allow the signal that's carried through these cells that will make them contract to physically carry from one cell to the next. Cardiac muscle, although you are not able to see it very easily in this image, is actually striated just like smooth muscle, but like you can see here, here's kind of a branching off point where you see the branching of one of these muscle cells, which is something that you won't see in skeletal muscle. There's no branching, they're just long lines. All right, and last but certainly not least, because it is my favorite of all, is nervous tissue. Nervous tissue, like muscle tissue, is excitable, but unlike muscle tissue, it can both send and receive signals. And these signals are electrochemical. Basically, a bunch of chemicals move around that have charges, and that causes an electrical signal to basically rush along the major type of cell called a neuron. Neurons are the ones that carry information around, send and receive signals, but they are very importantly supported by another class of cells called neuroglia, or sometimes just glia. So neurons are interesting because they'll only allow information to flow in one direction. So you have these three distinct regions of a neuron that are found in most, if not all, neurons. You have dendrites. They look like branches, which is why they got their name dendrite, because dendro means tree. Someone looked at those neurons and was like, wow, it looks like a tree branching. Okay, that's what we'll name it. Each of the dendrites receive information, whether it's from a sensory organ or from another neuron. And so there are connections coming in here and here and here and here. And then all of that information is integrated or put together here in the cell body. The cell body also contains the nucleus, but we're not going to focus on that. Instead, we're going to focus on the fact that the cell body is making a decision about, am I going to pass on information or not? If it decides to pass on information, it travels along the third structure in a neuron called a axon. An axon will take a signal to another cell. And axons can be short if the other cell that they're going to is nearby, or they can be super long if that other cell is far away. They can connect not only with other neurons, but also with organs called effectors. Effectors are organs that do something when the nervous system tells them to. So a muscle is a possible effector because it can contract when the nervous system tells it to. A gland is a type of effector because it can release hormones when the nervous system tells it to. It just depends on which cell you're looking at. But once you get to the ends, like here where you see this neuron connecting with another neuron, they don't actually communicate with an electrical signal anymore. Instead, they switch over to a chemical signal and they release these substances called neurotransmitters. If you've ever heard of serotonin or dopamine, these are two very important neurotransmitters in your brain that influence behavior and mood as well. Talk about them more when we talk about the nervous system. And the last type of cell that's found in the nervous system are glia. Glia are support cells, but they're not optional. They're not useless. Without them, neurons would not survive because neurons are so focused with all of their energy on making sure that information is passed on, that you make the right decisions from those information, passing on instructions, that they don't have the time to do things like provide their own nutrients or clean up the space around themselves. Like I said, I compare them to a very rich, very useless person who's never had to do anything in their life and needs like 5 or 10 personal assistants to run their life for them. That's a neuron. Neurons don't do anything on their own. Instead, they have all these other cells that do stuff for them. So, for example, a few types that we'll talk about now are astrocytes, which are these guys right here. They're named that because they looked kind of like a star. Their job is to keep things clean. So they will make sure that the conditions in the brain are right for neurons to be able to act and be able to react. They can take up or break down some of the neurotransmitters that get released between one cell and another. And that's important because if you don't take up that neurotransmitter, it just stays outside of another neuron, constantly saying, hey, 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 I got a message for you. Hey, 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 I got a message for you. And eventually that just becomes useless information. You want it to shut down when you want it to. And then microglia are not quite nervous cells. They are related more to cells from the immune system, but they're your brain's own personal army. and they will patrol just the brain to help protect it against infection. And then finally, we have these other cells, oligodendrocytes and Schwann cells, and their job is to make this fatty covering that insulates neurons called the myelin sheath. And it is very important because without it, your neurons will be very, very slow in sending information. And in fact, there are life-threatening diseases that actually gradually destroy this myelin sheath. Nervous system is no longer able to function, and then the person who has this is no longer able to control their body movements. So that is the end of our lesson. I hope that that was not too long or scary. I will see you guys in class.